Hey, wake up! It's Means Morning News. Just after 11 a.m. on the East Coast, I'm Sam Sachs. The haters said we couldn't do it, but look at us, on the verge of another weekend. Let's fire it up. And we begin on Capitol Hill, where Trump administration officials told members of Congress that they intend to continue to defy court orders related to the case of wrongfully deported Maryland resident Kilmar Abrego Garcia. First, it was Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, who testified before a Senate committee on Thursday. She was asked by Senator Chris Murphy what her department has done to comply with the 9-0 Supreme Court order to bring Abrego Garcia back from El Salvador. Here's how Noem responded.
That court decision requires the administration to facilitate Kilmar Abrego Garcia's release from El Salvador. Can you describe the steps that you have taken to facilitate this release? And specifically, can you answer as to whether you have reached out to your counterpart in El Salvador to facilitate Mr. Abrego Garcia's release?
Abrego Garcia is a citizen of El Salvador and should never have been in this country and will not be coming back to this country. There is no scenario where Abrego Garcia will be in the United States again.
Okay, so you're not doing anything. Noem is just going to keep ignoring the court order. Got it. Refusing to follow court orders is against the law. So too is engaging in mass human rights abuses, like stripping hundreds of migrants of their right to due process that was established by the Constitution and has been upheld by the Supreme Court over and over again. The problem is the government agency that would be charged with investigating and prosecuting these blatant crimes by the Department of Homeland Security Secretary also informed Congress it doesn't intend to take any action. At the same time Noem was testifying on Capitol Hill, FBI Director Kash Patel was also appearing before a Senate panel. Here he was being questioned by Senator Jeff Merkley about investigating the administration's crimes related to depriving migrants of their rights.
So are you going to launch an investigation of the reported violation of the due process of several hundred individuals?
Again, Senator, it's not for me to call the balls and strikes on it. The men and women at the FBI who are trained to open investigations will make those calls.
So you have no influence over whether an investigation is opened?
I have influence over it, but you're asking me a constitutional question. I'm not a constitutional scholar.
Well, it's actually not it's a question also of law. The question has already been answered by the Supreme Court that they're protected. Therefore, it's a violation of law, and it's your responsibility to open an investigation. And you're saying today you will not do so?
I am not the agency involved in removal proceedings. That is a different branch of government.
So if an agency other than the FBI violates the law and the Constitution, you will not investigate because it's a different agency?
I will investigate every violation of law.
Well, you have, but you just said you're not investigating.
No.
Yeah, I don't think we're getting anywhere here. The so-called law and order president has assembled a team that is making up the law as it goes in order to inflict the maximum harm on immigrant communities in the U.S. There is still a constitutionally prescribed method for dealing with this sort of lawlessness in the executive branch. It's called impeachment. But Republicans in Congress have no intention of pursuing that either. Staying on Capitol Hill now, but moving to the House side, the Natural Resources Committee approved legislation that marks a huge victory for sludge merchants and others who profit off the destruction of the planet. Republicans on the panel approved a portion of their forthcoming budget that would hand over vast tracts of government land to extraction capitalists and allow them to skirt environmental review. According to the Center for Biological Diversity, the new provisions would destroy public lands and speed up climate change. Legislation requires the government to open up more oil leases in the Arctic National Wild Refuge of Alaska, as well as the state's Cook Inlet and Brooks Range wilderness, disrupting the habitat of wildlife in the area. It also directs logging companies to cut down more trees by increasing production by 25%. And currently, companies have to pay royalties to the federal government for any extraction they do on public lands. But this bill lowers those royalties to the levels they were way back in 1920. And it gives companies the opportunity to pay a little extra to expedite environmental reviews and even to pay for industry stooges to conduct those environmental analyses. The group Public Citizen said in response to passage of the bill, "Welcome to the American petrostate." And finally today, there's a new pope, and he's an American. Cardinals at the Vatican elected Robert Francis Prevost, who was born in Chicago, to be the next head of the Catholic Church. He also has Peruvian citizenship, serving as a bishop and missionary there for more than a decade. Now, to the extent that these pope guys have an ideology, it's often derived from the name they choose. In this case, it's Pope Leo XIV, a successor to Leo XIII, who was a pope in the late 19th century and pioneered a lot of the church's social justice work and stood up for the rights of workers amid industrialization. So that could be a signal that, like his predecessor, Pope Francis, Leo intends to guide the church in a more egalitarian, pro-worker direction. But Prevost is considered more of a moderate on social issues than his predecessor. Back in 2012, he spoke out against homosexuality and same-sex families, and he's criticized transgender acceptance. This is also a pick that will not go down well with survivors of the church's child sexual abuse scandals. The Chicago-based group Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, or SNAP, included Prevost on a list of members of the church who covered up abuse. The group specifically cited incidents in the US and in Peru where Prevost failed to investigate claims of sexual abuse and allowed known abusers to remain in the ministry. So that's pretty bad. But I guess these people are creatures of the Catholic Church, so you have to grade them on a curve. Even Francis was criticized by survivor groups for not doing enough. Being an American, Prevost is in a unique position to challenge the Trump administration's, let's say, excesses. In the last few months, he shared multiple posts on Twitter criticizing the White House's mass deportations and anti-immigrant sentiments. One post shared by the new pope named both Trump and El Salvador's Nayib Bukele and criticized them for, quote, illicit deportations. And a few months ago, the Pope also shared an article contradicting J.D. Vance by name, back when the vice president tried to claim that Christianity teaches people to prioritize loving their own family before their neighbor and before the rest of the world. In the article posted by the new Pope, the author argued that Vance's concept of a hierarchy of love and compassion for others, quote, feeds the myth that some people are more deserving of our care than others. It's a framework that makes sense in a world governed by scarcity and fear, where protection comes at the expense of others. Leo would be the second straight pope who doesn't like J.D. Vance. UPS is still putting its drivers at risk by not ensuring trucks have air conditioning in the summer. 2 years ago, the Teamsters approved of a new labor contract with the company that required UPS to install AC and ventilation systems in its delivery vehicles. But that's not happening. Vivian Gonzalez, a driver with UPS, wrote in Newsweek recently, quote, perhaps we were too optimistic about how quickly UPS would meet its obligation. The truth is, UPS has been rolling out these new trucks as slowly as possible. They told us our facility would be the first to see these improvements, yet we have seen hardly any at all. Gonzalez noted that UPS management has instead offered condescending solutions, like telling drivers to take a break under a tree to cool down. She wrote, quote, "For someone in a cushy boardroom, that might seem reasonable. But for the people working in my facility driving rural routes up to 200 miles a day in the barren desert, it's laughable." As Teamsters members get screwed by UPS, the union's president, Sean O'Brien, has been busy podcasting and sucking up to opponents of the working class and conducting his own little Red Scare. This month, O'Brien hosted New York City mayoral candidate Andrew Cuomo on his podcast, giving the disgraced former governor a platform to attack socialist mayoral candidate Zohran Mamdani. And last month, O'Brien attacked the biggest supporter of the working class in Congress, Senator Bernie Sanders, sharing a right-wing New York Post hit piece that mocked Sanders and Congresswoman AOC for taking a private jet to rallies on their Stop Oligarchy tour. O'Brien also lobbied hard for Trump's labor secretary pick, Lori Chavez-DeRemer, a supporter of anti-union laws like right to work. Teamsters deserve a better leader. Before the weekend starts, we got to take out the trash. It's time for Rich Dicks. Thanks, gang, for all the nominations on Blue Sky and on the Means TV message board. We had multiple nominations for All the Dang Landlords, who are, of course, deserving every week. Here's a nomination for billionaire Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, one of Trump's biggest sycophants. The Adelsons were also nominated, though I think there's just one Adelson left, Miriam Adelson, who spent over $100 million to elect Donald Trump last election. Her husband, Sheldon, another notorious GOP donor, died back in 2021. And here's a nomination for Ethan Klein, who I believe is some sort of Zionist scumbag streamer, though I'll admit I try not to pay attention to those guys. But from clips I've seen on Twitter, it is a strong nomination. Thanks again, everyone, but in the end, I'm the one who chooses, and this week's Rich Dicks are private prison CEOs. Thanks to Daytona Slim for nominating J. David Donahue, the CEO of Geo Group, one of the companies profiting off President Trump's mass detention and deportation program. We're also throwing in the barrel Damon Hinninger, the CEO of another for-profit prison company, CoreCivic. The two men convened earnings calls this week, and they could barely hide their excitement about all the money they're making aiding the president's mass human rights abuses. Both Geo Group and CoreCivic have seen their share prices surge during Trump's second term. CoreCivic stock price is up over 40% over the year. Geo Group is up over 90%. And speaking with investors, both CEOs forecasted more good times ahead. Let's start with Donahue at Geo Group. Here's how he opened the call. Quote, "We believe we have an unprecedented opportunity to assist the federal government in meeting its expanded immigration enforcement priorities. And we've taken several important steps in anticipation of what we expect to be significant future growth opportunities and related operational activity during 2025. Again, when he's talking about growth opportunities, he's talking about locking people up. Donahue added that the company was working on a new multi-year detention contract with ICE that will generate revenues of $70 million a year. And that in addition to detention space, Geo Group was also looking to expand its services for ICE, including by offering GPS monitoring devices. Donahue estimated that there are upwards of 10 million people who could be in the crosshairs of the White House's deportation program, And new laws like the Laken-Riley Act, which forces migrants into deportation proceedings for simply being accused of a crime, not even convicted, just accused, means even more opportunity for profit. Because there's not enough detention space to lock all of them up, according to Donahue, so that's why the company is expanding into GPS tracking services. He also told investors that Geo Group is investing in its capability to provide transportation for ICE deportation flights. This is from the earnings call. Quote, "We expect an increase in the number of removal flights could generate an incremental $40 million to $50 million in annualized revenues under our existing ICE Air Support Services subcontract. On a combined basis, we estimate that the upside potential from all of these opportunities could represent as much as $800 million to $1 billion in annualized revenues. $1 billion. $1 billion to ruin millions of people's lives, the vast majority of which don't have any criminal record of any kind and have been thrown into incarceration simply because of their race." Donahue's counterpart at CoreCivic, Damon Hinninger, was also giddy about growth opportunities, jailing and deporting people. Here's what he told his company's investors this week. Quote, "This is such a significant moment of time in our company's history. Never in our 42-year company history have we had so much activity and demand for our services as we are seeing right now." Hinninger then said he expects more contracts from ICE as soon as Congress passes a new funding bill to boost spending on deportations. And he also addressed what is believed to be his company's main competitor, foreign prisons, like the one in El Salvador that the White House illegally deported hundreds of men to earlier this year. Here's what Hinninger said, quote, "We continue to believe that detention beds supplied by the private sector represent the best value and are the most humane, most efficient, logistically have the highest audit compliance scores in their system, and are readily available. Additionally, with 42 years of operating experience with ICE, private sector beds are the least likely to be legally challenged, particularly relative to some international options." CoreCivic actually played a role in deporting innocent migrants to El Salvador's terrorism confinement center. The Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel recently reported how a CoreCivic contractor for ICE was the one who made the determination that Andre Jose Hernandez Romero, a gay makeup artist living in California, was a member of the gang Tren de Aragua, based simply on a misinterpretation of Hernandez Romero's tattoos. Hernandez Romero hasn't been heard from since he was deported to El Salvador. Also, claiming you run a more humane prison than one of the most notorious torture prisons on this side of the world, it's not exactly the flex you think it is, especially when CoreCivic is notorious for running understaffed facilities that leave incarcerated individuals vulnerable to abuse and neglect. Audits of CoreCivic jails in Tennessee found rampant gang violence, instances in which known sexual abusers were placed in the same cells as potential victims, and cases where incarcerated individuals weren't provided their medication. Between 2019 and 2022, the state levied more than $40 million in fines against CoreCivic. And during that same time, more than 200 people died in the 4 CoreCivic-run jails in Tennessee, accounting for a third of all prison deaths across the state's system of 14 prisons. In a just world, the company would have been shut down by now, and no one would be allowed to get wealthy off mass incarceration. But this is the United States, where more people are in prison than any other country in the world, and for-profit prison CEOs thrive. So we're doing what we can around here by making them this week's Rich Dicks. All right, friends, the show ends today with a sunrise from Wisconsin. It was sent in by Robert over Lake Michigan in Milwaukee. Enjoy. Thank you, Robert. That's the show. Thanks for watching. Thanks to the team behind the scenes. Find more MMN at means.tv. We also have a YouTube and podcast channel, and you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky. One day capitalism will fall. Until then, we're going to be right here. See you next week.